In the early 18th century, Lima was not just a city, it was the beating heart of Spanish colonial power in South America. Its streets bustled with merchants trading silver from Potosi, silk from China, and spices from distant lands. The Catholic churches gleamed with gold leaf, and grand estates stood as fortresses of wealth and nobility. Among these estates, few names carried the weight and prestige of the Mendozas. The Mendoza family was not only wealthy, they were one of the most influential dynasties in Lima. Their fortune came from a combination of land ownership, political alliances, and deep ties with the Spanish crown. They controlled haciendas where indigenous people and African slaves worked the fields, producing sugar and crops that filled the family's coffers. To the people of Lima, the Mendoza name symbolized unshakable power, a family whose wealth could buy loyalty, silence, and respect. The Mendoza mansion itself was like a palace, its walls of stone and adobe towering over the neighborhood, painted white and adorned with intricate wooden balconies that overlooked the bustling city streets. Inside, chandeliers imported from Spain lit grand halls lined with portraits of ancestors dressed in armor and velvet robes. Every detail of the house spoke of wealth and tradition, and more importantly, of the family's determination to maintain control. But the most symbolic part of their estate was not the decoration or the architecture. It was the way the walls seemed to separate the family from the rest of society. To the Mendozas, those walls protected their honor. Behind them, they crafted their version of perfection, a noble bloodline untainted by scandal, a lineage destined to remain superior to others. This obsession with family honor was common among colonial elites. Nobility was not just a matter of wealth, it was about purity of blood. To marry within one's social class and ethnicity was to protect that legacy. To mingle romantically with indigenous people, Africans, or even Spaniards of lower rank, was seen as betrayal to the family name. And in this society, betrayal was punished with fire, exile, or even blood. At the center of the Mendoza family's pride was the young Marquise, beautiful, educated, and refined. She was the crown jewel of the family's future, groomed to uphold the honor of their name. Every gesture she made, every word she spoke, was measured against the expectations of nobility. She was to be married strategically, perhaps to another powerful family in Spain or Lima, ensuring that the Mendoza legacy would not just survive but expand. Yet behind her grace, the Marquise lived like a bird trapped in a gilded cage. She was constantly watched, constantly reminded of her responsibility. The Mendoza walls for her were not protection, they were chains. She was expected to be obedient, dutiful, and silent. To the world outside, she was a woman of privilege. To herself, she was a prisoner of tradition. But while the family flaunted their golden wealth, another world existed within those same walls. African slaves cooked their meals, carried their loads, polished their silverware. Indigenous servants kept the gardens alive, maintained the horses, and cleaned the lavish halls. These men and women were invisible to society, yet they were the very hands that sustained the Mendoza fortune. It was here, in these hidden spaces of the house, the kitchens, the stables, the courtyards, that another kind of humanity existed. Unlike the rigid hierarchy of nobility, life among the servants was marked by whispered stories, songs from distant homelands, and stolen moments of laughter. It was a world beneath the Mendoza pride, a reminder that the family's power rested on the backs of those they considered beneath them. And it was in this hidden world that the seeds of scandal were quietly planted. The Mendoza family believed their walls could protect them from scandal, shame, or collapse. But history teaches us that no wall, no matter how strong, can hide the truth forever. Their obsession with controlling their name, their wealth, and their bloodline blinded them to the humanity within their own household. They had built golden walls not just of stone, but of pride and arrogance. To them, love had no place if it did not serve the family. Choice had no meaning unless it upheld tradition. Their downfall would come not from poverty or war, but from their inability to see beyond those walls. The story of the Mendoza mansion is not only about wealth and scandal, it is about the dangers of building one's life on pride, control, and oppression. The golden walls were beautiful, but they were fragile because they were built on fear, fear of shame, fear of betrayal, fear of losing control. And just like every wall built on fear, cracks eventually appear. The Marquise's secret love, her defiance of tradition, and her pregnancy by a slave would become the hammer that shattered the Mendoza pride. What the family thought was unshakable would collapse in flames of scandal, and in that collapse history would teach us a lesson. True strength does not lie in walls of gold, but in compassion, truth, and freedom. In the shadow of the grand Mendoza mansion, where chandeliers sparkled and noble voices echoed with pride, lived a man whose existence was reduced to chains, commands, and silence. He was an African slave, one of many brought across the ocean to labor in the kitchens, fields, and stables of Lima. As most powerful families, to the world beyond the walls, he was nameless, faceless, and voiceless, another piece of property owned by the Mendozas. But history has a way of revealing truths hidden in plain sight. This man, stripped of freedom and dignity, was the one who saw what no one else dared to see, the humanity of the Marquise. The Marquise lived in privilege, yet her life was carefully scripted by the family's obsession with purity and honor. To outsiders, she was a jewel of nobility, destined for alliances that would strengthen her family's empire. But to the slave who watched from the shadows, she was not an untouchable goddess or a symbol of wealth. She was a woman. He saw the loneliness in her eyes when she walked through gilded halls, her smile carefully measured to fit the expectations of her family. He saw her pause at the balcony, staring beyond the walls, as though yearning for a world she was forbidden to touch. He noticed the subtle tremble in her hands when she was forced to perform her role in grand ceremonies, surrounded by men who viewed her as an asset rather than a soul. The slave recognized her cage, for he too lived in one. Hers was built of pride, gold, and duty. His was built of chains and cruelty, but in essence, both cages stripped them of freedom. For a slave to see humanity in a noble was already dangerous. For him to acknowledge it even silently was treacherous. Colonial Lima was a place where human beings were categorized: Spaniards, Criollos, Mestizos, Indigenous, and Africans, each with rigid roles and hierarchies. Love, compassion, or even friendship across these lines was forbidden, punishable by humiliation or death. Yet, in the quiet corridors of the Mendoza household, the slave could not help but notice her subtle acts of rebellion. Unlike the rest of her family, the Marquise sometimes whispered "thank you" when no one was watching. She would glance at the servants with a softness her mother and father lacked. When the family sat at feasts, she was the one who occasionally slipped food to the kitchen slaves, unnoticed by her relatives. Small as they were, these gestures were enough to awaken something in the slave's heart, something dangerous. He began to see her not as mistress, but as someone trapped like himself. It began with stolen glances. When she walked through the courtyard, her eyes would meet his, not in command, not in dismissal, but in recognition. For the first time in his life, he felt seen by someone who lived behind the golden walls. To her, his gaze was different. The nobleman of Lima looked at her as though she were an ornament, a prize to be displayed. Her family looked at her as a responsibility, a vessel for future heirs. But the slave's gaze was free of expectation. It carried no chains of duty or greed. It was simply human. That look spoke louder than words. "I see you. I know your cage, I know your pain." The Marquise found herself drawn to him, not out of rebellion alone, but out of a hunger to be understood. He was forbidden, yet he was the only one who treated her as a soul. Their connection deepened in whispers, in fleeting moments stolen between the duties of the household. In him she saw strength, not the brutal strength of soldiers or nobles, but the strength of endurance. He had survived capture, the Middle Passage, slavery, and humiliation, yet his spirit still carried compassion. In her he saw fragility wrapped in silk, a woman forced to smile even as her heart ached. Their bond was not born of fantasy but of truth. It was the meeting of two wounded spirits who recognized each other in silence. The slave's love for the Marquise was more than attraction. It was revelation. For years he had been told he was less than human. The law, the church, and the family he served all reinforced his inferiority. But in her presence, he felt the dignity he had been denied. She spoke to him not as property, but as equal. She saw his scars not with pity, but with understanding. In turn, he gave her something no nobleman ever could, freedom of the soul. Within their secret bond, she did not have to be a Marquise. She did not have to carry the weight of her family's legacy. She was simply a woman, alive and free, if only for stolen moments. But truth is dangerous when it challenges power. Their love was not just forbidden. It was a direct assault on the very foundation of the Mendoza name. For the family, such a union was unthinkable, a contamination of bloodline, a disgrace worse than death. Yet, despite the risk, they continued. Every glance, every touch, every whispered word was an act of defiance. The slave was no longer invisible, and the Marquise was no longer silent. Together, they proved that love could exist even where chains tried to crush it. The slave who saw her humanity reminds us of a timeless truth. True vision does not come from wealth or status, but from compassion. He saw what her family, her city, and her society refused to see, that beneath titles and chains we are the same. Their love may have been doomed, their lives marked by scandal, but in those brief moments they touched something eternal. They broke through the walls of gold and chains of iron. They proved that no system of oppression, no tradition of pride, can fully erase the power of human connection. And in that recognition, dangerous, forbidden, yet profoundly human, their story became more than a scandal. It became a testament to the courage of seeing the humanity in another, even when the world demands blindness. By the year 1721, Lima was not just a city. It was the jewel of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. It glittered with wealth drawn from the silver mines of Potosi, adorned with grand palaces, and ruled by noble families whose names carried weight across continents. Among these families stood the Mendozas, protectors of tradition and reputation. But no wealth, no name, and no fortress of pride could withstand what was about to erupt. For the scandal that broke out in Lima was not whispered gossip. It was an earthquake that rattled the foundations of power, exposing the fragility of honor, pride, and the dangerous consequences of forbidden love. Lima in the 18th century was a city ruled by appearances. Honor was not just personal, it was collective, binding entire families together. A single rumor could destroy alliances, unravel fortunes, and stain legacies forever. Among the upper classes, a woman's role was particularly strict. She was expected to be obedient, chaste, and the guardian of family virtue. The Marquise of Mendoza was not just any noble woman. She was the jewel of her house, the face of Mendoza dignity. Every step she took, every word she spoke reflected upon her family name. This is why her actions, falling in love with a slave, were not just seen as an act of disobedience. They were seen as a crime against her bloodline, a betrayal of her ancestry, and a humiliation that could not be ignored. The Marquise's pregnancy could not be hidden. In a world where every gesture was scrutinized, her condition became a ticking clock. At first, whispers spread quietly in the corridors of Lima as grand houses. Some dismissed them as jealous lies. Others chuckled in disbelief, a Marquise with a slave, impossible. But as the months passed, silence became impossible. When the truth surfaced, it did not trickle, it exploded. The Mendoza household, once a fortress of respect, was turned into a stage of shame. For Lima, as nobility, this was more than scandal, it was treason against the very order of society. How could a noblewoman, born of centuries of lineage, carry the child of a man whom society regarded as property? The scandal exposed something far deeper than the Marquise's personal rebellion. It revealed the fragile, hypocritical system upon which colonial Lima was built. Spanish nobility claimed purity of blood as their highest virtue, yet behind closed doors, the reality was often filled with contradictions. Many masters abused enslaved women, creating generations of mixed children whose existence was denied or hidden. But when a noblewoman chose love on her own terms, when she dared to cross the racial and social divide, not through coercion but through choice, society reacted with fury. The scandal forced Lima to face its hypocrisy. Men of power could indulge in secret sins, but women, especially noble women, were held in chains of honor. The Marquise broke that chain, and the sound of it shattering echoed through every street of Lima. Within the Mendoza household, chaos reigned. The patriarch raged, declaring that the family name had been destroyed beyond repair. Brothers whispered of disowning her. Cousins urged silence, while others demanded punishment. The Marquise, once sheltered by her family's golden walls, now stood alone, facing storms from every direction. Her love was not seen as love. It was painted as madness, corruption, weakness. To the Mendozas, her child was not a symbol of life, but a stain of disgrace. And in their fury, they sought not understanding but annihilation of all evidence. The Marquise had broken the unspoken law, and now the family was willing to sacrifice her to preserve their name. Lima became an audience to the tragedy. People in marketplaces whispered the tale. Priests thundered from pulpits about sin and disorder. Rival families secretly rejoiced at the Mendoza's downfall. But for the ordinary peoplens, enslaved Africans, mestizos, the poor, the scandal was something different. It was a revelation. For once, the suffering of the marginalized was not hidden. It was tied to the most powerful family in the city. They saw in the Marquise not just shame, but courage. For she had looked past the chains of race and status and chosen to see humanity where others only saw property. Her story forced the city to ask uncomfortable questions. What is honor worth if it destroys love? What is purity worth if it denies humanity? Though the Mendozas tried to erase the scandal, its memory lived on. It survived in whispers, in songs sung by slaves, in hidden writings passed down through generations. The Marquise's defiance, whether born of love, desperation, or rebellion, became a symbol of resistance against a world built on cruelty and lies. Her fall taught Lima that no fortress of pride, no wealth, no name can shield against truth. And while her family may have sought annihilation, her act of defiance carved a lesson into history. That love cannot be caged, humanity cannot be erased, and injustice cannot be hidden forever. The scandal that shook Lima was more than gossip. It was a mirror held up to society. It reminds us today that the greatest scandals are not those born from love, but those born from cruelty, hypocrisy, and the oppression of the weak. The Marquise's courage to see humanity in her slave, even at the cost of everything, is a lesson for us now. The Mendoza family of Lima had stood for generations as a symbol of Spanish dominance in the New World. Their wealth was unmatched, their name untarnished, and their lineage considered untouchable. They were a dynasty, built on silver from the mines, sugar from the plantations, and the unpaid labor of those they enslaved. Their palatial home stood like a fortress, its golden interiors glowing like a monument to power. To defy them was to risk not just social ruin but death. Yet in 1721, that seemingly unshakable empire began to crumble, not from an enemy army nor from political intrigue, but from within their own gilded walls. The scandal of the Marquise carrying the child of her enslaved servant was the first crack, but it was only the beginning. Once whispers spread beyond the Mendoza estate, Lima itself became a stage where the spectacle of their downfall unfolded. The annihilation of the Mendozas was not sudden. It was a gradual erosion, a tearing apart of power, honor, and the illusion of superiority that had cloaked them for centuries. The Mendozas' destruction was fueled not by poverty or by enemies at their gates, but by their own pride. For years, they had believed their name to be a shield against scandal, immune to the criticisms that plagued others. When the whispers of the Marquise's affair surfaced, the family chose arrogance over humility. Instead of quiet resolution, they lashed out, blaming rivals, punishing servants, and attempting to erase evidence of the affair. But the truth, like fire, spread faster than they could smother it. The church, normally an ally of noble families, could not ignore the weight of the scandal. A child born of a noblewoman and a slave was not merely gossip. It was an attack on the very hierarchy the Spanish crown had built to maintain control in the colonies. For the first time, Lima, as whispers were not about the wealth of the Mendozas, but about their disgrace. The family's fortress of gold began to look like a fragile cage. In Lima, society was ruthless when it sensed weakness. Rivals the Mendozas had crushed for decades suddenly found their voices. Merchants they had cheated, families they had humiliated, priests they had silenced. Everyone now saw an opportunity to reclaim dignity by striking against the once mighty house. The elite, who once dined at Mendoza banquets, began closing their doors. Invitations were rescinded, alliances evaporated, and proposals of marriage that once flowed toward the family's daughters dried up. The Mendoza sons, once admired as heirs of power, were mocked in hushed tones as the offspring of a tainted bloodline. The final blow came from Spain itself. Word of the scandal reached across the Atlantic, and royal officials began to question whether the Mendoza family had failed in their sacred duty to uphold purity and order. Investigations followed. Wealth could buy silence in the colonies, but it could not erase the stains of dishonor from Madrid's records. The annihilation was not only external but internal. In desperation, members of the family began to betray one another. Brothers accused sisters of complicity. Cousins whispered about the Marquise's supposed sins. The patriarch, once a figure of iron command, became paranoid, imprisoning servants and interrogating relatives to discover who had leaked the truth. But the secret had grown too large to be contained. The Marquise, isolated and vilified, became both the symbol of the scandal and its scapegoat. For her, love had destroyed the walls of fear she was born into. But for her family, it had destroyed everything they believed they stood for. Her name was erased from family records, her presence hidden like a disease they wished to cure. Yet even in her silence, the scandal lived on. The enslaved man whose love had been the spark of the scandal became an invisible force in the family's undoing. Though he vanished, some say executed in secret, others claim he escaped. The idea of him haunted the Mendozas. His presence was a constant reminder that their world had been upended by someone they once considered beneath them. It was not his power, but his humanity that destroyed them. He had reminded the world that love could exist even across chains, and that truth was stronger than gold. To the Mendozas, he was a ghost they could neither kill nor silence. Every sneer from rivals, every door shut in their faces, carried the weight of his shadow. By the end of 1721, the Mendozas were unrecognizable. Their wealth, while still vast, could no longer buy respect. Their name, once spoken with awe, had become a cautionary tale. Within a generation, their estates were divided, their alliances shattered, and their influence in Lima reduced to whispers of a bygone era. The annihilation of the Mendozas was not marked by a single event, but by a slow decay, the kind that begins with arrogance, grows with secrecy, and ends with the exposure of truth. They had built their empire on the backs of others, believing themselves untouchable. Yet in the end, their downfall came not from those who envied their power, but from their own refusal to face their humanity. The story of the Mendozas lingers not as a tragedy of love, but as a lesson in justice. Their golden walls, their empire, and their pride could not protect them from the consequences of dehumanization. The scandal revealed that power built on inequality is always vulnerable because truth has a way of breaking chains. For Lima, the annihilation of the Mendozas was a turning point, a reminder that no family, no matter how wealthy or powerful, was above accountability. For us today, it speaks louder. Arrogance destroys, but humility preserves. Power without compassion is fragile, but love, even forbidden love, has the power to outlast dynasties. The Mendozas are gone, their empire reduced to ashes in history's pages. But their fall reminds us of this eternal truth. Injustice carries within it the seed of its own annihilation. The truth is rarely free. In history, every truth that challenged power, tradition, and injustice came at an unbearable cost. For the Marquise of Mendoza, her truth was not simply an admission of love for a man society deemed unworthy. It was a firebrand striking at the very foundation of Lima's colonial aristocracy. The cost of her truth would not only destroy her house, but ignite the sparks of change, showing generations to come that humanity is never defined by chains, bloodlines, or gilded names. When the scandal of 1721 finally unraveled, it was not merely whispered in the salons of Lima. It thundered through its streets. The Marquise's pregnancy by her slave was a revelation that could not be hidden behind the gilded curtains of her mansion. Gossip turned to outrage, and outrage turned to vengeance. But beneath that chaos lay a lesson. Truth may crush empires, but it also plants seeds for new ones. The Marquise could have chosen silence. Many women of her rank throughout history concealed affairs, denied children, or pushed their sins into the shadows. But silence was not her weapon. By refusing to lie, she gave her truth power. She stood before the Mendozas, before her society, and admitted what they considered unforgivable, that her love belonged to a man in chains, that he was not her shame but her equal. Her choice to reveal what others would bury was costly. The Mendozas were annihilated, not only in the literal sense of their bloodline's destruction, but in the symbolic collapse of their honor. Yet her truth cracked open the illusion of purity and superiority the aristocracy had lived on for centuries. It forced Lima to confront a question it had long avoided. If a Marquise could love a slave, then what did it mean about the humanity of those in bondage? For the slave at the center of the scandal, truth was freedom, even if freedom did not come in the form of open fields or documents of manumission. His very existence in the Marquise's story redefined what a slave could be. He was not merely property, not an invisible body in the corner of a room, but a man with power, influence, and the ability to shake an empire by the simple fact of being loved. That love was his rebellion. He had no armies, no weapons, no titles, yet he shattered the walls of hierarchy more effectively than any soldier. His presence in her story remains a testament to something greater than power, the undeniable reality that humanity cannot be denied, even when the law writes otherwise. But let us not romanticize the cost. History tells us that truth often demands a cruel sacrifice. For the Marquise, her truth destroyed her family's legacy, wealth, and standing. For the slave, truth exposed him to vengeance from those who would never forgive his audacity to stand as her equal. For the unborn child, truth meant inheriting a world that would not be kind, a world eager to erase its existence. And yet, history also teaches that these sacrifices are never in vain. Every act of courage comes with pain, but that pain becomes the seed of transformation. The Marquise and her lover did not live to see a world of equality, but they cracked the shell of silence that protected injustice. The cost of their truth was immense, but in it was the birth of hope. The annihilation of the Mendoza house symbolized something deeper than scandal. It was the slow but certain death of a world that believed bloodlines were God-given thrones. For centuries, Spanish aristocracy in the colonies prided itself on purity of blood, maintaining its illusion of superiority over indigenous, African, and mixed populations. But the Marquise's love story tore through that illusion with ferocity. The Mendoza name, once a fortress of honor, became a cautionary tale. Their destruction whispered to Lima as powerful families, "Your walls are not eternal. Gold cannot buy silence forever. Bloodlines are not immune to collapse. If love could undo the Mendozas, what other truths could undo them too?" The story of the Marquise and her slave is not merely about scandal. It is about the eternal cost of standing for truth in a world that fears it. Each generation faces its own Mendozas, systems of power built on illusions, prejudices that masquerade as tradition, chains disguised as laws. And each generation must decide whether to remain silent or to bear the cost of truth. The lesson is clear. The truth will not always reward you with applause. More often, it will punish you, strip you of comfort, and test your resolve. But in the ashes it leaves behind, there is always something greater: hope. Hope that one day the sacrifices made by those who spoke when silence was safer will create a world where chains fall and walls crumble. Even in her ruin, the Marquise gave Lima a new story to tell. For the slaves in the market, whispers of her defiance lit a fire in their spirits. If a noble woman could risk everything for love, then perhaps they too were not invisible. For the women trapped in arranged marriages, her courage was a reminder that hearts cannot be dictated by contracts. For those who believed they had no power against the structures towering over them, her scandal proved that truth alone can rattle foundations. Hope is often born in the shadows of destruction. Out of the fall of the Mendozas came a new kind of history, not the history of mansions, titles, and wealth, but the history of courage, defiance, and humanity. The cost of truth will always be high. For the Marquise and her slave, it was their family, their honor, their safety. But their story echoes across centuries because of that cost. They remind us that truth may annihilate the powerful, but it also births hope for the powerless. And perhaps that is the true legacy of Lima, as 1721 scandal, not the shame of a fallen house, but the courage of two people who refuse to let chains define love. Their story tells us that though truth is dangerous, it is also the seed of freedom, and that freedom once planted cannot be annihilated.